My family said I died at birth. Now they expect me to care for the mother who gave me away. I grew up in the United States, specifically in Austin, Texas. From as far back as I can remember, my father's gentle Canadian accent and my mother's Greek lullabies shaped my sense of family. My dad was a tall, calm man in his 70s, now 70, who always carried with him a quiet sense of humor and an unshakable sense of integrity. My mother, who is now 68, was the opposite in many ways, fiery and emotional, given to tears as quickly as she was to laughter, always fussing over me, her only child. We lived a comfortable life in Texas, and each summer from the time I was a toddler, we vacationed in Greece to spend time with my mother's parents, my maternal grandparents. That was always the highlight of my year. The summers in Greece were idyllic. My grandparents owned a small house by the sea, in a little village with narrow streets that meandered up and down the rocky coastline. From the front porch, we could see the crystal blue waters of the Aegean, watch fishing boats drift in at dawn, and listen to the cheerful chatter of neighbors who passed by on the stone walkway. My grandfather, Papu, would take me out on a little fishing boat sometimes, teaching me to tie knots, letting me listen to stories of his youth in a Greece that felt ancient and mysterious. My grandmother, Yaya, was the best cook I've ever known. She would hand-roll phyllo dough, conjure up entire meals from a handful of fresh vegetables, olive oil, and herbs grown in her own backyard. The smell of oregano, thyme, and rosemary infused everything. I cherished these summers. They were weeks of sun-drenched days and warm evenings where the entire village came to life after dark. Music would play from someone's radio, lights strung across balconies would twinkle, and children would run around chasing each other while older folks sipped coffee and discussed politics or local gossip. It was magical. I remember thinking, even as a teenager, that this was the way people were supposed to live. Connected, close, and filled with a sense of community. When I turned 18 and went off to college, I still made the journey out to Greece every year if I could manage it. My grandparents would look older each time, but they never lost their spark. My mother, in particular, adored them and always said that Greece was home in her heart, even if she'd spent most of her life in Texas. My dad, with his Canadian roots, would joke about how strange it was that he, the actual foreigner, felt so at ease in Greece, and that my mom, who was Greek by birth, could still be tripped up by the complicated grammar of the Greek language. They were a sweet, harmonious couple. Looking back, I can see how deeply in love they were, standing side by side through everything. By the time I was in my mid-20s, both of my maternal grandparents were well into their 90s. I was 25 when my grandmother, the same loving woman who taught me to roll dolmades, passed away. It was a massive blow to all of us. She left behind a house and a substantial sum of money, not just bits and pieces, but a sizable inheritance. I assumed, like many in our family, that it would pass quietly on to my mother. There were no dramatic will readings or family feuds in front of notaries. Nothing like that. It was pretty straightforward. But what transpired behind the scenes during my grandmother's final months was anything but straightforward. My mother had gone to Greece months before Yaya passed, intending to care for her in her last days. Dad remained in Texas at first to tie up loose ends with his job, retirement paperwork, and other responsibilities. It was meant to be a brief separation for them. My mom, being so close to her mother, was absolutely determined to be there to feed her, to make sure the doctors did their job to hold her hand at night. Sometime in that final stretch of life, as my grandmother lingered in a state of partial lucidity, she made a shocking confession that would rattle my mother's entire world. She told my mom, "You were adopted." Not in a gentle, prepared conversation. No, from what my mother has shared, it came out in fragments, almost a delirious confession. My grandmother was racked with guilt, it seemed, and didn't want to leave this life without telling the truth. My mother was stunned. Adopted? She had grown up surrounded by a large extended family, all presumably blood-related. She had never suspected a thing. She had no recollection of a time she felt different from the rest. Sure, she was an only child, but in many Greek families, that's not uncommon. She'd always assumed her parents had trouble conceiving or simply didn't want more than one child. But no, she was adopted, and not in a formal adoption agency sense. This was an old custom in some Greek villages, especially decades ago. If a couple had too many children and struggled financially, they might offer one baby to a close relative who couldn't have kids. It was a taboo practice, shrouded in secrecy, especially in older generations. My mother spent many nights sobbing by my grandmother's bedside, trying to glean more details. But my grandmother was weak and passed on within days of this revelation. There was no time for the full story. The final bombshell my grandmother dropped was that the woman my mom had always called her aunt, her grandmother's cousin to be precise, was her actual birth mother. That one sentence changed everything my mother had believed about her own life. In the wake of my grandmother's passing, My mother made a choice. She inherited the house and the money, yes, but she also inherited this secret that she now felt compelled to uncover. My dad, who was about to retire, was more than supportive. He'd always loved the slower pace of Greek life and told my mom that if she needed to go to Greece long-term, he would go with her. And that's precisely what happened. I remember feeling a bit of whiplash as my parents sold their home in Austin, organized their affairs, and uprooted themselves to live permanently in Greece. They moved into the inherited family house, though it was initially in need of some repairs. My parents spent a good amount of their retirement funds upgrading the plumbing, shoring up the old stone walls, painting shutters. It became a beautiful home set on a hillside not too far from Athens, with a vantage point that showcased the sea in the distance. My mother, meanwhile, embarked on a personal quest to find out more about her biological family. Her search led her to a region in northern Greece, where she discovered that her biological mother was still alive. Through some old family contacts and a few reluctant neighbors, people who knew bits and pieces of the story, my mother learned the truth. Her mother, my bio-grandmother, had come from a family that prized male heirs, especially because they worked the fields and brought in income. She'd already given birth to 2 sons, and then my mom arrived. At the time, the family was struggling financially. They saw a baby girl not as a blessing but as an added expense. My mother was given away to my adoptive grandparents who had no children of their own and who desperately wanted a daughter. In the decades that followed, nobody spoke of it. The entire village had apparently been told that my mother had died as an infant, some tragic illness, or so they said. Even my mother's older brothers, as children, were told that their little baby sister had passed away. Only the mother and a few trusted relatives knew the truth, including my adoptive grandmother. For my mom, this was a seismic revelation. All her life, she had revered her parents, my grandparents, for their love, devotion, and kindness. And she still does. But now, a swirl of complicated emotions took hold. She felt betrayed that nobody had ever told her she was adopted. She felt sorrow that she had missed out on knowing her biological family. And yet, she felt anger toward them for giving her away, especially since they kept the other children. When my mother finally met her biological mother, it was not a tearful, joyful reunion. Her mother was in her 80s by that point, a frail but stern woman who carried an air of pride. My mother's 2 older brothers were there too, and so was a younger sister, a sister who was born a few years after my mother. My mom's oldest brother broke down in tears, claiming he had a vague memory of the day my mother was taken away. He said he was haunted by it but never spoke of it, because as a child he was told that baby had died. My mother later told me how surreal it was to see these grown men cry for a baby they believed had been lost over half a century ago. Yet despite the seemingly emotional welcome, my mom felt an undercurrent of tension. None of them had ever tried to find her. None of them had ever reached out to my adoptive grandparents to ask how she was doing, or to see if she was thriving. Their reason? She was in America, and they had no idea how to track her down. My mother found it hard to swallow. People wrote letters back then. You could make phone calls, ask relatives, there were ways. But apparently, the entire arrangement had been sealed with a vow of secrecy between my adoptive grandmother and my biological grandmother. They wanted to protect each other from scandal, from gossip, and from the heartbreak of confusion. Thus began a 10-year saga. My parents settled in Greece, and my mom, despite her reservations, tried to build some sort of relationship with her biological siblings. Her older brothers turned out to be reasonably welcoming, at least at first, and her younger sister was polite but distant. She had gone abroad for work and only visited Greece occasionally. Their mother, that woman who had given my mother up, remained like a shadow at the edges of every family interaction. My mother just couldn't bring herself to feel any love for her. Anger boiled under the surface. Resentment churned whenever she thought about how her biological mother had kept her 2 sons and eventually her other daughter, yet gave away the girl who was born in between. As the years passed, I graduated college, worked in Austin for a while, and then 2 years ago I decided to join my parents in Greece. My adoptive grandparents, the ones who raised my mother, had left her a significant inheritance as well, ensuring we were financially secure. I liked the idea of a quieter Mediterranean lifestyle. My fiancé, who is Greek, also found the prospects there appealing. So we settled near my parents in a scenic area not far from the capital. Life, for the most part, was peaceful. My mom busied herself with gardening, going to small local markets, sometimes meeting her siblings for coffee. And then, about a year ago, the storm started brewing. My mother's biological mother was now 96 years old, bedridden, and in very poor health. She required constant care. Her husband, my biological grandfather, had passed away decades earlier under political circumstances, which, as we would later learn, meant he was involved in far-right extremist activities during Greece's tumultuous political climate in the mid-1900s. He'd left behind some wealth, mostly from unethical means, apparently, but that's a whole other story. The day-to-day care of this ailing 96-year-old woman fell to my mother's older brothers. Their wives, already exhausted by the demands of raising children and managing households, began complaining. They felt it was unfair that they should shoulder all the burden of caring for this elderly woman, who was still quite difficult and mean-spirited by their accounts. At a family gathering, one I didn't attend, my uncles confronted my mom. They insisted that she too was responsible for caring for this old woman because she's your mother too. My mom came home that night, visibly shaken. She told my dad everything. I cannot overstate my father's reaction. Picture a mild-tempered Canadian man, normally relaxed and good-humored, absolutely erupting in anger. He reminded my mother in no uncertain terms how this woman had abandoned her, how she'd never lifted a finger to find her, never apologized properly, never truly tried to be in her life. He insisted that my mom owed her nothing. And I, hearing the story, was equally furious. The gall of these people to come to my mother, a woman they let slip away into another country, never once seeking contact for decades, and demand she care for this old matriarch who had shown no genuine affection toward my mom whatsoever. My mother, though, was torn. She had built relationships with her siblings over the past decade. She didn't want to lose that. She had grown fond of some of her nieces and nephews, who saw her as this cool aunt from America. And her siblings, though flawed, were still a connection to the biological roots she had discovered so late in life. She didn't want to sever those ties completely, but she also felt no love for her mother. No compulsion to care for this elderly woman who had caused her so much pain. She told them outright that she didn't feel responsible for her care. In Greek families, this stance is often seen as taboo. Caring for one's parents, especially in old age, is considered a moral duty. But my mother had valid reasons, emotional reasons, that collided painfully with these cultural expectations. I was so outraged on my mom's behalf that I began considering drastic measures. I'm getting married in a month, and my fiancé and I are planning a modest ceremony at a small local church near the coast, followed by a reception in a beautiful garden. We're not inviting hundreds of people. We want a relatively intimate affair with close friends and family. But now, I wanted to uninvite my mom's biological siblings, the uncles and their families, and even the younger sister who lived abroad. I felt like they were adding stress and drama we didn't need. By uninviting them, I felt I'd send a clear message. Don't mess with us. Don't try to manipulate my mother into doing something that violates her emotional well-being. My mother, however, was hesitant. She felt that uninviting them would pour fuel on the fire, escalate tensions, and possibly cut her off from the nieces and nephews she genuinely cared about. She worried about the wedding day turning into some battleground of resentments and accusations. She'd always taught me to approach people with compassion, no matter how flawed they were, and to avoid burning bridges unless absolutely necessary. Yet I saw her pain, the anguish in her eyes, the knot of stress in her shoulders. It infuriated me. I turned to Reddit for advice, posting under a throwaway account. I laid out the situation. The demand from the biological uncles, my father's anger, my mother's torn loyalties, my own protective rage. The outpouring of advice and personal stories was incredible. People told me about their own experiences with secret adoptions, estranged biological families, manipulative relatives. Many told me to cut them off, to shield my mother from further hurt. Others advised a more nuanced approach, reminding me that my mother might value some contact, if only for the sake of her relationship with her nieces and nephews. I was so touched by the responses that I showed them to my mom. She spent an entire evening reading through the comments, tears welling in her eyes at the stories of others who had gone through similar betrayals or discoveries later in life. It led to the deepest conversation I've ever had with her, spanning hours. She opened up about the heartbreak she felt over the years, the idealized image of a big Greek family she had carried in her mind, and the stark reality she discovered. It was then she told me more about something that had happened a few years prior, something I hadn't known in full detail. My bio-grandmother, it turns out, was not just a stern woman with old-fashioned values. She was cruel and spiteful. She had mistreated the people who worked for her, the neighbors who were unfortunate enough to be on her bad side, and even her own children. My mom learned this from Maria, the wife of one of my bio-uncles, who had approached her quietly one day and told her the real story. Maria recounted how my bio-grandmother had never wanted daughters. She saw them as useless mouths to feed, while sons could work in the fields, manage the properties, and continue the family name. She had tried to give away her other daughter too, but that adoption never got finalized. My bio aunt, who was ultimately forced to stay, suffered years of neglect and emotional abuse. No wonder she fled abroad the moment she was old enough. My uncles had, in many ways, benefited from their mother's preference for sons and rarely intervened in the mistreatment of their sister. They even cheated that sister out of part of her inheritance when their father died. Maria herself felt she had entered into a marriage with a man who carried on many of his mother's self-serving traits. Over the years, Maria had endured enough. With her own children grown, she was considering divorcing my uncle. She confided in my mom that she simply couldn't abide by his behavior anymore. He was manipulative, arrogant, and had a shady moral compass when it came to money. She also confirmed that these men had inherited quite a bit of wealth, some from their father's dubious dealings during times of political turmoil, and had used that to prop up various business ventures. When those businesses faltered, they didn't hesitate to take more money from their mother, or from relatives, without paying them back. My mother was horrified and deeply saddened by Maria's revelations. It shattered any last illusions she had about her biological mother being a misunderstood or repentant figure. And it also cast her brothers in a new, less sympathetic light. She realized they might be friendly on the surface, happy to meet her, to share a coffee or a meal. But underneath it all, they were shaped by that same environment, that same worldview that daughters, and women in general, were there to serve some function or provide money. This led my mother to form a sort of tentative, minimal contact relationship. She kept things cordial with her siblings, saw them at Christmas or Easter gatherings, but never let them in on her deeper feelings or finances. She found more joy in connecting with her nieces and nephews, some of whom had turned out to be quite compassionate, open-minded individuals. My mother especially took a liking to Maria's son, who was in his 20s. He reminded her that not everyone in that family was rotten. The question of their mother's care, however, hung over everything. The uncles believed all siblings had a duty to pitch in, whether that meant taking the mother into one's home or paying for a professional caregiver. My mother, citing the adoption, insisted she had no legal or moral obligation to do so. She'd never been recognized as a daughter in that family, had never inherited anything from them, and was never included in any familial decisions until she showed up 10 years ago. If anything, she was the leftover they had once discarded. But my mom also felt pangs of empathy, not for the old woman, but for her younger sister, the one who lived abroad. That sister was under pressure from the brothers, too. She was seen as unfilial for not being in Greece to help. My aunt had endured a harsh upbringing and wanted to keep emotional distance, but that didn't stop the brothers from berating her. So my mom considered a compromise. She offered to pay a quarter of the monthly cost of a care facility. In Greece, it's still somewhat frowned upon to place an elderly parent in a nursing home. Many see it as abandoning them. But my mom felt it was a fair solution that would ensure the mother received proper care without burdening any one sibling excessively. Of course, my uncles were offended. They saw it as an insult to their mother's dignity. But they also didn't want to pay for private care. What they really wanted was for my mom to personally take the mother in, to serve as caretaker for several months out of the year, rotating with the other siblings. That was a line my mother refused to cross. She was adamant that she would not welcome that woman into her home. She had no emotional bond with her, and the memories of how she was cast aside as an infant loomed too large. Her adoption wasn't some random tragedy. It was a deliberate decision rooted in misogyny and convenience. My father backed her up completely. He even wanted my mom to cut them off altogether, telling her that they were manipulative. He worried they'd try to exploit her financially or emotionally. The last straw for me was seeing my mother's distress. She'd built this fragile connection with these siblings, hoping for a sense of belonging she'd missed out on. Now, they were demanding emotional and physical labor from caring for the very woman who had set all this heartbreak in motion. I wanted to protect my mother at all costs. Meanwhile, I was in the midst of wedding preparations. My fiancé, a wonderful Greek man I'd met in Austin while he was on a work exchange, had integrated seamlessly into my life. He adored my parents, especially my father's calm nature and my mother's vibrant energy. We decided on a smaller wedding in Greece to honor my mom's heritage, and because, quite frankly, the setting was breathtaking. But as the big day approached, the tension with my mother's biological family threatened to overshadow the joy of planning a wedding. In the midst of all this drama, something beautiful happened. I realized that not everyone in that biological family was out to manipulate my mom. Maria's son, my cousin, reached out to me. He was in his mid-20s living on his own, making a decent living in a tech-related field that intersected with my fiancé's work. We all decided to meet for coffee one evening. He confided in me that he was disgusted by his father's behavior and that of his uncle. He said they had no shame about mooching off others or demanding money without accountability. He respected my mother greatly for being honest about her feelings and not caving to their demands. This cousin told me he was biding his time before cutting ties with his father. He wanted to wait until his mother, Maria, sorted out her possible divorce. He felt protective of her and didn't want his father turning on her before she was ready to leave. He also warned that my uncles might be scheming to get more money out of my mom. They think Americans are rich, especially because she inherited something from her adoptive parents. They won't stop until they get it. That conversation changed my perspective. It also gave me a powerful sense of validation. My instincts about these uncles weren't baseless. They were, in fact, trying to exploit my mother's guilt and longing for family. Armed with this knowledge, I went straight to my mom and dad. We sat down that night and had what we referred to as a family conference. I shared everything my cousin told me, every detail of his father's and uncle's manipulative tendencies, the warnings about potential financial exploitation, and his advice that we stay away. For a while, my mom sat quietly. She was remembering moments over the past decade, little red flags she had brushed aside, small comments about money, entitlement, or attempts to impose cultural guilt. She realized she had overlooked these signs because she was so desperate to belong to a big Greek family. She told us she felt foolish, but my dad quickly reassured her that it wasn't foolishness. It was hope, a hopeful heart wanting to see the best in people. In the end, we arrived at a decision. My mom would contribute a one-time lump sum toward the cost of her bio-mother's care. Whether they used it for a private caregiver at home, or for a nursing home, or even if they squandered it, was up to them. She would give that money and make it absolutely clear this was all she intended to provide. No rotation of duties, no personal caregiving, no emotional labor. She would also have a final conversation with her brothers to lay out her stance. I will not be taking care of our mother because she was never a mother to me. This path wasn't simply about saving face, it was about closure. My mother needed the symbolic gesture of giving something. Not because she owed them anything, but because she wanted to free herself from any lingering guilt or what-if scenarios. She wanted no regrets, no second-guessing later in life. If they still shunned her after that, so be it. After deciding on this plan, we addressed the wedding question. I was leaning towards striking the uncles off the guest list. But my mother hesitated. She reminded me that uninviting them might lead to explosive drama, overshadowing the wedding we'd all worked so hard to plan. Additionally, my mother was quite close to some of her nieces and nephews. We worried that if we uninvited the older generation, the younger ones might feel compelled to boycott in solidarity, or simply feel unwelcome. My mother didn't want to create more divides than already existed. She said, "After the wedding, life will go on. If I've cut them off from this important day, I can't take that decision back." In the end, we reached a compromise. They would be invited, but we would keep the interactions courteous and limited. We also didn't plan to seat them at our main table. They'd be placed among other extended relatives, but not so close that we'd be forced to engage in deep conversations with them throughout the event. If they chose to make a scene, we'd have close friends prepared to step in and diffuse any tension. If they declined to come, that was their choice. At least we wouldn't be the ones slamming the door. With the wedding so near, we all felt relief in having a plan. But as these things often go, more revelations emerged. My mother admitted she had also been in touch with her younger sister, the one who had moved abroad long ago. The sister came to Greece this past Christmas and stayed with my mom. They had a heart-to-heart. My aunt shared harrowing stories of her child, her mother's favoritism toward the boys, the constant reminders that she was a financial burden, the emotional abuse that left scars she still grappled with as an adult. She had chosen to keep a distance from the family, physically and emotionally, but she was glad my mother had found her. She told my mom that she loved her dearly, and if she could turn back time, she'd have rescued her from adoption or done something to prevent it. Of course, she was a child herself at the time. She had no say in family matters. When my mother asked her sister about the future, my aunt was blunt. "Cut the brothers off." I did. "They only cause pain." She extended an invitation for my mom to join her abroad, suggesting they could start a new life, free from the heavy baggage of the past. My mother appreciated the offer but wasn't ready to uproot again. Besides, she felt a sense of belonging in her current life in Greece, minus the toxic relatives. She wanted to stay close to me and my dad, and she had her circle of friends here. Interestingly, my aunt was financially independent and never once asked for anything, confirming she had no hidden agenda. It was a stark contrast to the uncles, who seemed obsessed with money. My mom felt validated in her decision to only maintain superficial contact with the brothers. She saw them for who they really were, products of a manipulative, patriarchal upbringing, lacking remorse for the pain they'd caused. Nonetheless, my mom didn't want to lose her nieces and nephews. Some of them, like my cousin who'd warned us, were genuinely decent people who wanted to break free from the family's toxic cycle. I realized that families, especially in cultures like Greece, can be unbelievably complex. There's a strong emphasis on loyalty, tradition, and caring for elders. But there's also a dark side, unspoken rules, patriarchal norms, and manipulations that can tear people apart. My mother was caught between these cultural expectations and her own emotional trauma. She needed to find a way forward that didn't betray her own well-being. As for me, I had to keep reminding myself that this was my wedding, my fiance's wedding, a day that should be about celebrating love and unity. I couldn't let these uncles' demands overshadow that joy. So, after many late-night talks with my parents and my fiance, we decided, yes, we invite them. If they come, they will see the strong, loving family my parents and I have built. If they don't, we'll still have a day filled with love and support from the people who genuinely care about us. About 2 weeks before the wedding, we had a final showdown of sorts. My mother, my father, and I met with the uncles at a neutral location, a cafe in a busy square, so nobody would dare raise their voices too loudly. My dad took the lead in the conversation, stating clearly that my mother would provide a one-time financial contribution toward their mother's care. He slid an envelope across the table. My uncles eyed it with a mixture of greed and indignation. My father then stated, "But please understand, this does not obligate her to any further responsibility. She will not be hosting your mother in her home. She will not be acting as a caretaker. Do you accept this?" One uncle started to protest. "But this is your mother. She gave birth to you. My mom interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "She is not my mother. She gave birth to me, yes, but she never acted like a mother. She gave me away, never looked for me, never told me the truth, and never showed me love. I'm offering this money so I can keep my conscience clear. That's all. I will not discuss this further." The uncles looked at each other. We could see them struggling, torn between wanting more money and not wanting to lose face. They could hardly make a scene in a public place. Ultimately, they took the envelope, which contained a bank draft for a sum that was neither extravagant nor paltry. It was enough to cover a chunk of a caregiver's salary or a nursing home stay for several months. Then they stood, muttered something about how they would expect her at the funeral at least, and walked away. My mother breathed a shaky sigh of relief. My dad placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, and I leaned in to give her a hug. She looked more at peace than I'd seen her in months. I think it was because the final line had been drawn. She had done what she considered morally right without sacrificing her mental health. Whatever came next, whether the uncles cut us off or demanded more, she had nothing more to give. The wedding day arrived on a bright, sunny morning. The church we'd chosen was perched on a small hill with a view of the sea, a nod to those childhood summers I'd spent by the water. My fiancé and I felt a swirl of excitement as friends and relatives gathered, the hum of conversation filling the air. My mother looked radiant in a pale blue dress, and my father wore a proud smile that never left his face. The uncles did show up, along with their wives. They took their seats, not close to the front but near the middle rows. They looked stiff and a bit out of place amidst the joyous atmosphere. A couple of my cousins came too, including the one who'd warned us about them. After the ceremony, we proceeded to an outdoor reception. Greek music played, and there was dancing, laughter, the smell of delicious food wafting through the air. I made sure to greet them politely, no more, no less. They congratulated me and my husband, offered some perfunctory gift, which I guessed might be more for show than sincerity, and then drifted off to mingle with other guests they knew. It was clear they were not going to put in extra effort to be friendly, but neither were they causing trouble. Later in the evening, I saw them sitting at their table, somewhat apart from the festivities. They weren't the life of the party, and that suited me fine. I watched as a couple of them left early, giving an excuse about needing to get up early the next day. My mother, too, noticed, but she didn't seem upset, more like relieved. It was a sign that we could coexist at an event without any big fireworks. And if that was the extent of our interaction with them, she was okay with that. After the wedding, life settled into a new normal. My mother stayed in touch with a few nieces and nephews she genuinely liked, people who seemed to respect her boundaries and appreciated her for who she was. Maria continued her divorce proceedings, with my parents offering moral support. The uncles occasionally tried to contact my mother about the old woman's care, complaining that the money was almost gone. But my mother stood firm. "I've given what I will give," she told them. "I wish you well, but that's it." As for my biological grandmother, she remained in poor health, attended to primarily by a hired caretaker once the uncles realized they couldn't handle it alone. My mother made no attempt to visit. She'd said her goodbye in her own heart. If the day came that the old woman passed away, my mother wasn't sure if she'd attend the funeral. She said she might go out of respect, but she wouldn't be mourning. And that, too, was a boundary she felt was necessary for her emotional well-being. In the months that followed, I watched my mother transform. The stress and anxiety that had weighed her down lifted. She embraced the life she had with my father, gardening in the sun, hosting dinners for friends and neighbors, even traveling occasionally with me and my new husband. She spoke more openly about her gratitude to her adoptive parents, the grandparents who raised her, who had truly loved her as their own. She wished she could have shared what she'd learned with them, but they'd both passed away years before. Still, she felt their loving presence in her heart. When I asked her if she regretted seeking out her biological family, she paused thought. Part of me wishes I never opened that door, she admitted, but part of me is grateful I did. I have a sister who loves me. I have nieces and nephews who might not be perfect, but some of them are wonderful people I would never have known otherwise. And I've learned so much about myself in the process, about what I can forgive and what I cannot. One day, as we sat in her garden, she confided in me something that brought me to tears. If my birth mother had been remorseful, if she'd shown genuine regret for giving me away and for never trying to find me, maybe I would have cared for her in her old age. Maybe I would have felt a duty or at least a desire to help. But she never gave me that. She couldn't even muster an apology. She was cold. She made excuses. And I realized that I can't build a bridge to someone who's never lowered theirs. I hugged my mom, tears in my eyes, and told her how proud I was of her strength. She had walked such a lonely road, trying to reconcile her childhood memories with this new reality. She'd done her best to show kindness while protecting her own heart, and she'd emerged with a sense of peace, or at least something close to it. Today, I reflect on the entire journey with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. Sadness for what my mother endured, the initial abandonment, the shock of discovery, the tangled web of family secrets, and the manipulative demands for caregiving. But gratitude for how it all turned out in the end, with my mother finding autonomy and closure, connecting with a sister who truly loves her, and building relationships with nieces and nephews who see beyond their parents' flawed values. I also carry a renewed appreciation for the grandparents who raised my mother in Texas, the only grandparents I ever really knew. They were incredible people who showered my mom and me with love, never once making us feel anything but cherished. My mother and I often talk about how we wish they'd known the full story, if only so we could thank them even more for being the loving family we needed. I think they knew in their hearts how important they were. Sometimes, late at night, I think about how easily my mother's life could have turned out differently. If she'd stayed in that Greek village, she might have faced neglect and abuse under the thumb of a cruel mother. Instead, she was raised by two people who adored her and gave her every opportunity to thrive. In that sense, the adoption, though shrouded in secrecy, was a blessing for my mom. She avoided a tragic upbringing and found her way to a happier, healthier life. As for me, I'm enjoying married life in Greece. My husband and I have our own home near my parents, with a view of the sea reminiscent of those childhood summers. We share dinners with my folks, exploring new recipes, going for walks along the coastline, occasionally venturing into Athens for a dose of city life. I feel at peace here. I have some contact with certain cousins on social media, exchanging casual greetings or jokes. The uncles remain on the periphery, and that's fine by us. We don't need them close, we just need them not to interfere. And so, if there's a moral to this story, it's that family can be found in those who truly love and stand by you, whether they share your blood or not. My mother learned this lesson in the hardest way possible, but she came out stronger, knowing exactly who her real family is: my dad, me and my husband, the memory of her adoptive parents, and a handful of genuine souls in the extended biological clan. Everyone else, she keeps at arm's length. Logical conclusion. In the end, my mother found balance and closure. She refused to be manipulated into caring for a woman who had never cared for her. She upheld the relationships that mattered, like the one with her sister Maria and the considerate cousins, and let go of the toxic ones. As for the uncles, they continue to care for their mother, now well into her late 90s. And they occasionally make noise about how unfair it is. But my mom doesn't budge. The lines have been drawn, the boundaries set. She did her part by offering a final financial contribution and a clear explanation. I gotta have my wedding free of the drama I'd feared might explode. Despite the presence of these difficult relatives, the day was beautiful. My mother even danced joyfully at the reception, tears of happiness in her eyes, not tears of sorrow or anxiety. That's the image I hold in my mind when I think about family. My father's arms around my mother's waist as they sway gently to a Greek folk song, a lifetime of love shining between. We can't choose the family we're born into, but we can choose how we respond to them. And sometimes, if fortune smiles upon us, we find a family that chooses us, raising us with unconditional love, no matter where our DNA leads us. My mother and I are living proof that the family you build can heal the wounds left by the family you lost. Thank you to everyone who followed this story and offered insights, empathy, and support. Our hope is that others in similar situations find the courage to draw boundaries and prioritize their own peace. Life is far too short to carry the burdens of a past we didn't create, especially when we have so much to look forward to in the present. If there are any more updates, like if the uncles attempt some new scheme or if my mother's sister moves closer, I'll be sure to share. But for now, we're content. We've found our footing on this rocky path, and we're walking it together, as a family in the truest sense of the word.